And before we start anything, the first thing I'd like you to do is to turn off your communication device, or at least silence it. You know, this is the time. As you know, at all of these programs, we have a 5-minute infomercial from Chemical Heritage, and then we'll have our program. But before we start that, I want to make a couple of announcements. First, this is the first time we ever had this format of a networking brunch, and then at noon to start a panel discussion in which you will have the panelists and each one will speak and then have a discussion. It's a different format. It's something we're testing. And so the Chemical Heritage Foundation is going to send an email to each of you, provided you've given them your email address when you registered. If you need to do that when you're leaving, please do so. And over the next week, they'll send out an email to each of us, and at that time, with a set of questions. And if you would it'll be short, do it then, send it back to them, and we'll have a sense of what you think about this format to do this once or twice a year. Before I introduce the CHF representative, this is going to be a good time for a bathroom break. So I'll give you 5 minutes or so, and then we'll come back. Before I introduce the CHF representative, just to tell you about next month's program, we have the president and CEO of Elevance Renewable Sciences. You probably have read about them. They're doing a lot of work on using biotech for chemicals. And this should be an exciting, she's got a very exciting company, and it's on May 8th, 4 weeks from today. So hopefully all of you can be here with us. In terms of the Chemical Heritage Foundation, this afternoon we have Shelley Wilkes-Geer here. She's the director of the Roy Edelman Institute. And she's going to talk to us briefly about an activity she's got going on right now with the Philadelphia Science Festival. Shelley?
Hi. Delighted to be here today, delighted to see so many faces that I recognize. And as Tom said, I am here to talk to you about one of my favorite springtime activities with the Chemical Heritage Foundation, and it is the Philadelphia Science Festival. So to give you a brief history, whoops, how do I go back? There we go. Sorry about that. A brief history about the festival and its place in Philadelphia and, in fact, throughout the country. It was founded in 2009 by the Science Festival Alliance, which received funding from the National Science Foundation and founded science festivals in the coasts, basically. So we have UC San Diego, MIT's museum, the Franklin Institute here, and UC San Francisco, so that there are science festivals coast to coast, not so much in the middle of the country, which does concern me, but I don't actually get to decide these things. How come I can't use the clicker? I've become technologically challenged? Is that the problem? Oh, you have the clicker. That's why it's not working. Anyway, so the Philadelphia Science, now it's working without me. I'm so sorry. The Philadelphia Science Festival is actually unique among the Science Festival Alliance in that the programs are specifically designed to be collaborative. Almost all of the STEM organizations throughout Philadelphia participate in the Science Festival, and most of the programs in the festival are designed and put on by more than one of our collaborators. So that is especially important to the Chemical Heritage Foundation because it allows us to expand our reach and to develop partnerships with some very important local organizations. On to the good stuff. What is CHF doing this year? Well, this year we have a theme because the Science Festival coincides with the sort of end of our Sensing Change exhibition. It's really moving without me. We are sticking to the themes and the goals of that exhibition to support our programming. So the first one takes place on April 27th. High Waterline is actually a program developed by one of the artists featured in Sensing Change, Eve Mosier, who, and I have to read this or I'll get it wrong. Is there a timer on these? Who focuses on creating interactive public projects that abstractly investigate the human condition in relationship to the world in which we live. Eve has done this program in New York City and in Miami, and what it does actually is it takes a group of folks. So CHF, Eve, festival participants and residents of the Kensington community will come together on April 27th and literally draw a chalk line that will show the water level if there is a 10-foot rise in sea levels. And that line will go through Port Richmond and New Kensington from Frankfort Creek to Penn Treaty Park. At the end of this walk, which is about 3 miles, we will all come together at 1800 Blair Street, which is also known as the Big Green Block. And at that point, community organizations will be there to talk about their work. There will be some workshops or activities around the concept of sustainability, and another way for folks to get together and talk about the issues of climate change in Philadelphia. Moving on, for those of you who are more competitive than community-based, I invite you all to take a chance on the smartest quizzo in town. Form a team and be prepared to answer questions on all aspects of the sciences, including science history. So I would suggest, everybody try and get Karsten on their team or another one of the historians at CHF. Karsten doesn't want to play. So you'll have to find one of our other historians. Moving from that, something that is more kid-focused, the festival requires us to do a neighborhood science event, which is an after-school event in the local libraries. And so this year, we are doing something called Lungs in the City, which will allow kids at the Fumo Family Library on South Broad Street to look at the role that plants and trees play in keeping our air clean within cities. Then finally, on the very last day of Sensing Change, we invite you actually to come into the Chemical Heritage Foundation on First Friday and talk about the weather. We'll have a meteorologist, a sustainability expert, a climatologist, and Eve Mosier will be here in case you missed High Water Line on the 27th. You can talk to her about the program there. So that should be a great way to end Sensing Change. It's a great way to come back and say farewell to what has been a spectacular exhibit for the organization. So I ask you to attend any of these programs, or if they don't appeal, there are many more. There are program brochures in the lobby. Feel free to pick it up, or check out the website where you can search through the calendar and, this is amazing, book various tickets. All of our events, for your information, are free this year. The high water line does require advance registration so that we're aware of how many people we need to shepherd down Kensington. So thank you very much. I'm not even touching the clicker. I give up.
I hope Larry and his team do not have too many slides. We have a technician here who's going to check this out, because apparently it's on some sort of timer. Is there anything you can do to de-time this? Let's hope we're back on track. It's my great pleasure this afternoon to introduce today's moderator and program. Since 2010, our moderator has headed SACHA as its president and CEO. As many of you may have seen in the March 31st issue of CNE News, there was an excellent article about Larry and SACHA and what he has been about. And so if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to dig that back out and read it over. It talks about his focusing the organization on some key areas of emphasis as they go forward, and also establishing a rebranding on the concept, SACHA is the voice of the special chemical industry. Now, in addition to what he does at SACHA, Larry has quite a background that fits with what we do here with the Priestley Lectures. First of all, he has a chemical engineering degree from the University of Pennsylvania. He has a master's in management from the Kellogg School of Northwestern. He has experience that started at Air Products, and then he was at Nalco. And in 2010, he started working inside the Beltway in the nonprofit trade association sector. And in addition, he serves on many boards, including the Chemical Education Foundation, and also the executive committee of the Joseph Priestley Society here at Chemical Heritage Foundation. So it's my pleasure to introduce Larry, our moderator this afternoon.
Good afternoon, everybody. So this program was supposed to be 2 months ago when we had that awful snowstorm. So obviously the weather's cooperated today, and we're delighted to have you all here. Now, let's see if it works for me. All right, very good. So, Tom, should I have the panelists come up now, or do you want to wait until after? Let's have the panelists come up now, if you don't mind. We've got Jim DeLisi, who is president of Fanwood Chemical, and Lynn Bergeson, principal, attorney at law with Bergeson and Campbell, and they're going to be our featured panelists this afternoon. And before we turn the program over to the panelists, I just have a few comments to present on SACHA and our policy positions with respect to the subject matter today, which is chemical risk. Now, I'm assuming everybody in this room has heard of SACHA. They know the acronym. You may have seen that in the media and the press. For those of you that are not familiar with the organization, SACHA is a 92-year-old trade association based in Washington, D.C. We've got a budget of about $5 million and a staff size of just under 30. And we have three main strategic directions. So everything that we do is built around the specialty chemical sector. And the three strategic directions focus on, number one, how do we help our members' businesses work smarter, and how do we help them expand their businesses? And we have a variety of programs and services to help our members do that. We have various networking events throughout the year, including our golf tournament here in Philadelphia that sponsors or funds the Young Scholars Program with ACS. We have an annual dinner, which is a big networking event in December up in New York. We have ties to the Informex trade show that we started back in the mid-1980s and later sold, but we're still tied to it. We have a leadership conference that we're putting on in a few weeks down in South Carolina. So a whole variety of networking programs for the industry to convene, network, and learn from one another. Second strategic direction is all about how do we help to instill greater public confidence in the chemical industry. And that's really about our environmental health, safety, and security program that we call Chem Stewards. Now, for those of you that have been around for a little while, SACHA used to participate in the Responsible Care Program, which is what the bigger chemical companies do, the Dows and the DuPonts of the world. But we spun off in 2005 to create a program that was tailored more specifically to the unique and differentiated interests of batch specialty chemical companies. And that program is going to be celebrating its 10th anniversary next year. Very excited about that. And every other year, this year being one, we have regional events throughout the country, and we'll be holding our Northeast Regional Chem Stewards meeting here in Philadelphia in the middle of May. We also have operator training programs that are designed to help train operators in chemical plants, both large and small, and we're doing quite a bit of outreach these days with community colleges, because a lot of the folks that are coming to look for employment don't have the skill sets, and the community colleges are stepping up and playing a role in educating these folks about the basics of running a chemical plant. And our chemical operator training manual has been around for many decades, and we're very pleased to bring it into the 21st century and have an online program set up for chemical operators to learn from. And then last but not least, which gets into the subject matter for today, is advocacy. A lot of what we do in Washington is going to be mirrored by some of the other associations. TSCA reform is a shared interest of dozens, literally dozens of associations in DC. We get involved in a lot of trade issues, chemical risk management, get involved in plant site security, and a whole variety of other issues. But in addition to the advocacy that we do in Washington with the folks on Capitol Hill, it's the regulatory compliance that our members need the most, because these guys don't have all but one or two EH&S professionals on their teams. They don't have big staffs like the big chemical companies do. And with the myriad of regulations that faces the U.S. chemical industry, they need our assistance in interpreting these regulations for them and helping navigate those waters. So that's just a snapshot on who we are as an organization. And as we switch to the issue of chemical risk policy, we all know that there are a lot of incidents that occur on a regular basis that call for the need for smarter, more pragmatic chemical risk management. TSCA's been around since 1976. The only thing that we can all agree on, the non-governmental organizations, the environmentalists, the tree huggers, the SDF, all those folks, and then us on the chemical side, is the fact that there is a need for reform. But there's still miles of difference apart between the interests of the environmentalists and what they think chemical risk management reform should look like versus what organizations like SACHA and others feel like reform should look like. We know about things that happened in Texas, that horrific accident last spring at the fertilizer plant. We know what just happened a month or so ago in West Virginia with that spill. Whenever something like this happens, it is impingent upon the entire chemical supply chain to take action. And the answer is not more regulations. The answer is not more regulations because it's only going to further complex an already very complicated marketplace. The answer is to really look at the existing regulations and figure out how to make them work smarter. And a lot of the work we're doing in Washington right now is talking to the regulators and talking to the folks on Capitol Hill and saying, more regulations is not the answer. What we've got to do is we've got to work at the state and the local level with the emergency responders and the whole patchwork of regulators and firemen and policemen and all the other folks that are so important to the fabric of the local community. And figure out a way for these folks to be able to talk to one another in a more coherent fashion. The problem is that because very little has been done on Capitol Hill, the Obama administration has stepped up and is taking more action on the regulatory side. So in the absence of legislation, in the absence of real progress on Capitol Hill, the administration is saying, we need more regulations. And there's been literally hundreds and hundreds of regulations that have been promulgated over the last several years that are only confusing the industry and making it harder to comply with the regulations that are in the books. Global trade is a big issue for us. We pay over $1 trillion in tariffs each year, $1 billion in tariffs each year. Organic chemicals pay slightly more than half of that. And we're talking right now with regulators overseas on a US-EU free trade agreement called TTIP. And we're very excited about this because not only will it help to reduce or eliminate tariffs on both sides of the pond, but it will also allow us to hopefully harmonize some of the regulations. Now, I'm not going to tell you that TSCA and REACH are ever going to be the same. That's not going to happen. But there are things that the US and the EU can do to harmonize inspection procedures with, for example, the drug plants on both sides of the ocean, and also just some of the standards that are put into place with respect to the industry. And so we're looking forward to some fruitful discussions as we look toward a future US-EU free trade agreement. We always make a very positive case for smart regulation. And what we've started to do with the folks on Capitol Hill is talk about the issues, not in a vacuum, but talk about it in terms of how does it make the specialty chemical industry more competitive and innovative, because that's our strength. And secondly, how can we become more globally competitive? And so whenever we talk about an issue like TSCA reform or plant safety or R&D tax credit reauthorization or something as glamorous as that, we always phrase it in terms of competitiveness or global expansion to help the regulators and help the legislators understand the impact to the industry. Because as you know, the chemical industry is used in some 95% of products that we use every day. And as you know, or may not know, only 1 out of 5 consumers is actually in the United States. There's a whole market out there for chemical products in countries all around the world, including the developing nations. And so we need to do what we can to make sure that the regulations and the laws that are being put on the books are not going to stifle our innovative spirit and the fact that we are a global competitive industry. One of the things that we're doing with respect to trade issues is there's something called the miscellaneous tariff bill. And we're not going to really talk about it today, but it's one of my favorite topics, and it's something that SACHA has been very active in taking a stand on. And that has to do with raw materials that US chemicals buy where there is not a US supplier. They have to go overseas for this particular product. Well, chances are they're going to pay a tariff on that product. It's not hurting or helping a US supplier because there is no competitor. Unfortunately, the whole miscellaneous tariff bill, which was in a 3-year reauthorization cycle, got stuck with the fiscal cliff at the beginning of last year. And so we're now actively working with the powers that be in Washington to jumpstart that process and get it back up and running, because our members are paying tariffs from a couple percent all the way up to 20 or 25% on selected purchases of these raw materials. They're having to pay these duties and tariffs now. and that's only making them less competitive. And so we're trying to make sure that programs like this that have benefited U.S. chemical companies are put back into effect. We talk about task reform, and Lynn's going to spend a lot more time talking about this in a little bit. Confidential business information, CBI, you hear about that CBI quite often, is a very, very important issue for the specialty chemical industry. It's the lifeblood of our industry because most of our innovations are not patented or patentable. Trademarks and trade secrets are the rule. Very, very hard to manage those when you have to disclose the chemical identity of your molecule. So we're very concerned about CBI protections on any type of TSCA regulation. The new chemicals portion or provision within the existing TSCA has worked very well for our industry, so we're very mindful about how that's going to work under a new version of TSCA. And finally, we are advocating for the EPA to have the resources and the authority to go downstream and to go to our members' customers, the formulators of various products, and get the data they need from them in order to manage the chemical inventory. One of the things that our friends up north in Canada are ahead of us on is resetting the inventory. There's 20, 30, 40,000 chemicals in commerce here in the United States. When you read the media, they talk about 80, 90,000 chemicals in commerce, and that's just an erroneous number. That's not really true. A lot of those chemicals are no longer in commerce. So we want to reset the inventory, and we want to figure out a way to assess the prioritization of risk against those chemicals. I'm going to hear a little more about that with Lynn's conversation. Talk about REACH. Jim's going to focus a little bit on the barriers to REACH with respect to SMEs and the fact that there are a lot of data that's been collected in Europe because of REACH. Well, can't that data somehow be shared with our folks here in the United States? And that's something that we're working with the regulators on as to if there's going to be some harmonization with respect to a US-EU free trade agreement, can there be data sharing between the governments? Is there a way to make that happen so that we're not reinventing the wheel? And with that, I'm going to turn over the presentation to Jim. Jim, again, president of Fanwood Chemical, is going to talk about the topic of REACH and the impact in particular on small, medium-sized enterprises.
Is this working? Perfect.
Okay.
Okay. And this is the zapper?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. From an American perspective, and frankly from a small business perspective, I'd like to talk with you a little bit about REACH. I've been talking about REACH since the year 2000, when Jim Cooper, who at the time was SACHA's regulatory guy, convinced me to make a speech at Global Chem, and I was going to kill him when I figured out what I'd done, because it meant I had to read the statute, and much like healthcare in the United States, the REACH statute is about that thick. It's a lot of fun. This act was actually implemented in 2007. A lot of people like to forget that, but it's the registration, evaluation, authorization, and there's a silent R that people forget at their peril, restrictions. This act is designed to restrict the use of chemicals. The foundation of the precautionary principle. Those that may not understand the precautionary principle, it basically says if there's a chance that something's going to hurt us, we're not going to do it. There is no risk-benefit analysis in the precautionary principle. Second foundation, no data, no market. So if they feel that there is insufficient data to justify the use of a material, it's not going to be on the EU market. One substance, one data set. As many of you will know, it is an absolute violation of US antitrust for companies to get together in the United States and build an MSDS sheet. In Europe, you have no choice but to take that action. So you've got competitors have to, in US speak, collude on things like MSDS sheets. It also strongly encourages the substitution of hazardous chemicals. It's easy to argue that's not a bad thing. Initial pre-registration results. They got 2.7 million pre-registrations received on 146,000 substances. Larry talks about resetting the TSCA inventory. 146,000 substances is how many products were in INEX and E-Links. And there were 2 or 3 companies that just pre-registered everything because pre-registrations were free. However, it was 20 times what the system was designed to handle. So you can imagine what a nightmare it was in October, August, September, and October 2008 I guess that was 2008 as people were doing their pre-registrations. 65,000 companies pre-registered chemicals. 82% of those, small business. But then they were very disturbed to learn that only 10% of the registrations that they were expected in 2010, and a couple of slides will describe what the requirements for 2010 registrations were, only 10% of them were actually filed. And as of May 2013, frankly, I'm struck by this statistic. 28,000 dossiers received from 7,300 products. That means that chemicals in commerce above 100 tons, there's only 7,300 of them in Europe, or 100 tons per supplier, rather. Exceptions. This is important to understand because there are a lot of people in the United States that say, why should I bother with the European Union? There's got to be some way around it. Well, there are ways around it, but they're few and far between. Don't sell to the EU. The EU has not figured out, as the US has not figured out, how to do anything about to citizens that are not actually EU members. They can't sue you. They can't do anything to you if you're operating in the United States and you are not a so-called EU person. So simply say no. Reacted chemical substances. You can require your EU importer of record to comply, but if you do that, you got to tell them what it is and everything that's in it, including stabilizers, dedustants, anything else that's part of that product to make it work. Formulated products. You can imagine a guy trying to ship a gallon of paint to Europe from the United States. I mean, there could be 35, 40 different components in that gallon of paint. Any ingredient sourced from a European company that produced in the European Union, if it has been registered, can be used in the United States without further work, as long as your European supplier will give you permission to do it and it's carefully documented. You can convince your suppliers to cover your end uses. Some suppliers are seeing the ability to do this for their downstream customers as a real sales tool. Others are saying it's extraordinarily difficult. My IT system isn't set up for it. If I make a mistake because of something you did, I'm going to jail. Forget it. I'm not going to do that. In other instances, some, especially the larger US companies that have only representatives in Europe, are saying use our OR and you can save some money. You can limit each importer of record to 1,000 kilos, because anything less than 1,000 kilos is not covered by REACH. I would submit, if you're sending 100 tons of things to Europe, having 100 different importers of record is probably more complicated than actually complying. Products and process-oriented research and development. The European Union, when they put this thing together, they realized it was an absolute innovation killer. Because in order to sell anything in Europe or make anything in Europe, you have to comply if you're over a ton. So they put this in effect so that if you've got something that's very limited use, you can apply for an exemption. They last 5 years, they're renewable once, but materials must only be used by highly trained, highly qualified folks. So this is a very limited exemption, but there is ability to do this. This is super important because unlike TSCA, REACH covers pharmaceutical intermediates, so that the pharmaceutical industry would have been done without this, at least in Europe. Key registration dates. December 1, 2010. Anything over 1,000 metric tons a year had to be registered then. And then as an extra incentive, very toxic to aquatic organisms over 100 metric tons. Some people got some surprises here that they did not realize that this was going to kick out a requirement to register in 2010. And then CMRs over a ton, so carcinogens, mutagens, reproductive toxins. That caught a lot of people by surprise. 24,000 dossiers, 4,300 substances. That was all that was registered in 2010. It helps give you an idea of what's happened to the European chemical industry, which still is the largest. The European 28 is still the largest in the world. It's not really what it was 10 years ago, and 10 years from now, it's going to be even less. In red, the last bullet. Substance identity profiles. 70% of the substance identity profiles are now being questioned by the agency. In other words, The whole basis of this regulation requires an extraordinarily detailed report on what you're actually put in commerce in Europe. And now they're saying that the 70% of the identity profiles that were presented are deemed inadequate or need to be revised by the agency. I would submit that if 70% of the people are speeding, there's something wrong with a speed limit, not something wrong with the work that the people are doing. June 1, 2013, about a year ago. Substance over 100 metric tons, but less than 1,000. There were 9,000 dossiers received from 3,215 companies, representing approximately 3,000 more substances. Here's where it's really going to get to be fun. June 1, 2018, anything over 1 metric ton a year must be registered. And we all know that some of the most colossal plants, they make a gazillion tons of stuff. They need a little bit of something. It's a catalyst, it's a dedustant, it's an anti-caking agent, it's God knows what. This is going to be really painful when all of a sudden those huge monstrosities have difficulty getting the individual little itty-bitty components they need. The other thing that REACH does that a lot of people don't think about is part of the reason the Europeans have been so great at manufacturing is the skills and the qualities of their purchasing folks. They know how to source from any place. They're really great about making sure they've got diversified sources, diversified currencies, diversified raw material flows, even diversified processes when they can. Effective June 1, 2018, unless the stuff is registered, their hands are tied. They can't do it. So if you get an unexpected problem with one of your suppliers, they're going to have real problems. If you have not complied and you're not in violation of the law, there is still provisions to late pre-register. Material has to have an INEX number, and it must not have been imported illegally or you got real problems. And it must be a minimum of 1 year before the registration deadline. New substances. If you really want to do something new, and I have to tell you, there's not really very much new stuff going on in Europe because of this, and frankly, even INEX, there was some studies done that showed the US and the Japanese were greatly outdistancing the Europeans in the creation of new entities prior to REACH. Now it's even worse. Exempt if it's less than a metric ton. Over a metric ton, you must register. If you are not an EU person, because you go back to the fact that the EU has no way to prosecute somebody that is not a citizen, you must use a so-called only representative. An OR must be, according to the statute, an OR must be a European person, must be knowledgeable in the handling of chemicals, and in effect becomes the REACH importer of record. Those of us that have been involved in international movement of chemicals, what basically it does is it bifurcates the importer of record duties so that you've got a REACH importer of record and then a customs and every other reason importer of record. This is catching some folks too. A non-EU producer can only have one OR. So if you're working through a bunch of agents or something like that, you have to select one of them to be the OR, because an agent or a distributor is not a so-called actor in the supply chain for REACH, so they cannot have an OR. In February 2013, the Commission was required to do a report on the activities of REACH and the impact it was having on commerce in the chemical industry. They were concerned about the non-compliance, they were concerned about inefficient assessments, and the costs of REACH. They recognized that they were discouraging some companies from competing in some markets, and the European Commission acknowledged prices were going up for raw materials to many European companies. You imagine if the United States government ever had to acknowledge that the rules that they took were increasing our prices. I mean, I don't think they'd acknowledge it. They're doing it, but they wouldn't acknowledge it. And the Commission reported that 25% of the companies surveyed had reduced and withdrawn products. They also recognized that the financial burden on SMEs, small medium enterprises, was much higher than they had dreamed it would be. And the thing that makes this even more difficult is the European definition of SME is much different than the US definition. You're really small when you meet the European definition of an SME. harmonizing member state regulatory burdens. REACH was supposed to remove all of the other state rules and regulations on the chemical industry. It has not done that. There are still some countries that have requirements that are above and beyond REACH. And the Commission wanted to continue to review the innovation gap that they saw widening between the US, Japan, and the European Union. This is a place where a lot of smaller companies are going to get caught really hard. There are special rules for intermediates, materials that really are not in commerce for consumers. Nobody has defined strictly contained. If you picture someplace between somebody dumping a 25-kilo bag or a 20-kilo bag and hooking a tank up with a hard hose to a reactor, that's strictly contained. Someplace between there is the definition of strictly contained. It's causing a lot of problems. If strictly contained and less than 1,000 metric tons, there's almost no requirements to the registration. If it's over 1,000 metric tons, there is limited testing that's required. But as I say, no clear-cut definition of strictly contained. And here's another statistic that I find startling. 86% of the dossiers that were filed as intermediate status in 2010 are being questioned because did it really meet the status? The use of personal protective equipment is not considered part of strictly contained. So if you by definition, if you have to wear a spacesuit around the material, it's not strictly contained. This is a little discussion about sizes. Less than 10 employees and turnover assets of less than 2 million euros. I mean, that's really not much. So it's just, we don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but if size does matter, and as you can see, the sizes on SMEs is much more restrictive in Europe than it is in the United States. I mean, less than 250 employees with annual turnover less than 50 million euro. That's a small company in the United States for most rules, laws, and regulations. In Europe, it's a medium enterprise. Lessons learned. Management, upper management has to be very, very heavily involved from the very beginning. Deadlines need to be met. I mean, there is no, the administration here in the United States keeps pushing back some of the deadlines for Obamacare. There is no deadline pushback on this. I mean, you either meet the deadline or you're out of business. A whole bunch of companies played around with their sizes to try to save some money in registration. They got caught and they lost their registrations were removed. The misclassification of intermediates is rampant in their eyes, not necessarily in the eyes of the regulated industry, but they believe a lot of that has been done. Consortiums have turned out to be much more efficient way to accomplish this goal. We'll talk about that a little later. The use descriptor system. When you file a registration, you have to carefully detail all of the end uses. And you would have thought that somebody would have said, this is a pretty complicated thing, let's make it pretty simple. Well, the registration guidance on use descriptors is about 1/2 inch thick. And if you're talking about a bucket of paint, is it sprayed, is it rolled, is it brushed, is it indoor, outdoor, is it done by consumers, is it done by professionals only? It's unbelievably complicated. And interestingly, as much as everybody likes to talk about natural substances, and you're going to have a speech here next month about natural substances, REACH is an impediment to natural substances. If you take something like diesel, cracked from an oil barrel, it's exempt. Biodiesel is covered by REACH. And we talked a little bit earlier about substance identity profiles. When man makes something, he normally works real hard to have a set profile on what he makes, and he repeats it. Time after time after time after time. When God makes the stuff, he's not so concerned about making it the same. And sometimes, especially if it's grown, did the sun shine? Was it rainy? All of those things have an impact on, or can have an impact on the consistency, on the constituents when you're really doing a very detailed analysis. So there's a strong bias. It's much more difficult to put together a reasonable substance identity profile on a natural substance. If you're involved in REACH, start early, start early, start early. Guys that like to do everything on the last minute are in deep trouble when it comes to REACH because there's way too much to do. Substance use profiles are really important, and communicating down this supply chain and understanding whether your substance is a substance or an intermediate is unbelievably important. And if you're not active in a registration process, you're dead. And toxicologist is king in this. You need to have a good toxicologist from the very beginning to help you understand the way your substance is going to respond to the REACH requirements. Letters of access is a critical milestone. I'll talk about that a little bit later. IT systems. Almost all companies now run on an IT system. I mean, the 3x5 cards are long since gone. Adapting your IT system to this can be very, very difficult because you need to keep careful track of anything moving to Europe to make sure you don't cross any thresholds that you weren't intending to. And so the IT systems become to be king here if you want to stay out of jail. Hard copies. A lot of us don't like to keep hard copies, and they believe that since a lot of this information is held on the REACH website, the so-called REACH IT system, that it's good, golden, no problem. Well, as any other website, it makes mistakes, and if you got hard copies, you got a way to say to the agency, here, I did it, even though you say I didn't. If you don't have hard copies, if they can't find it on their website or in their IT system, you didn't do it. Studies. With a huge change in this industry over the last 25 years, there are file drawers full of stuff that the current management doesn't even know exists. Businesses that got sold years and years ago, businesses that were shut down. You may even have some of those files at home. There's a few people in here that's got more gray hair than me. You may have taken some of this stuff home. If you've got studies, they are valued at their current replacement cost, and you got a drawer full of stuff that you thought was going to the shredder, all of a sudden can be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Consortium. The legislation talks about so-called CIFs, Substance Information Exchange Form. The word consortium is not in the legislation at all. However, the legislation requires the so-called CIFs to work with by consensus. Unfortunately, in some of these CIFs, you've got 100 companies, only 5 of which are really, really interested in getting the work done. And you can't, I have not a hard enough time coming to consensus with my wife. I can't imagine if I had to do it with 5 or 6 other people in a room. So consortium have become the way to get this done. And so if you've got a strategic product, if a consortium exists, join it so you can understand what's going on. If not, form one is the only way to effectively get all this work done. And it's not too late to do it. If there is no consortium and there's not going to be, lead to CIF. If it's a non-strategic product, you got 2 cases. One, you can say to yourself, I'm shipping 90 tons and I'm going to walk away in the middle of 2018. Perfectly legitimate strategy. Cut your amount of money you're going to spend to the minimum, milk it till the middle of 2018, and then leave. Nothing wrong with that strategy. But if you're going to stay and you intend to register, you need to get active now. Data sharing. There's been a lot of problems with this. There is no guidance on the regulation. The regulation, though, does say, especially in the case of animal testing, if I own the animal test, if I had the animal test studies done and I own them, I must share them with you. It doesn't say how and how much. And so there's been a huge amount of fighting over how the studies are going to be shared. Basically, what's happening is that the consortium are rounding up all the information from their members. Consortium's got expenses, and they're often having to add additional information into what their members bring to the party. And so the consortium are offering letters of access with a 20% markup, some kind of a sweat equity fee, and then if there's 5 companies in a market and 2 more want to come in, they're taking that total and dividing it by 7, and you pay that amount of money into the consortium, 1/7 of it. That's what most of them are doing. There are others where they're much larger, where there's hundreds of people that need a registration dossier, they're just setting fees and they're charging people for it. So it varies from product to product, but you can figure if it's a small specialty chemical, it's going to be damned expensive. If it's a widely used material, it's going to be less. You have to be real careful because the chemical safety reports that go with a registration dossier, some of these things are hundreds of pages long, may or may not be part of it. And the thing that's hidden from a lot of people that I don't completely understand, since almost everything that got registered in 2010 had a test plan that went with it to be finalized after the fact, when you accept that letter of access, you are also accepting an ill-defined amount of money to fund the test plan. And so, and in fairness to the consortium members, they don't, if you say to them, what's the test plan going to cost? And anybody gives you a firm answer, the answer should be, we're not sure, because the agency is still evaluating the plan. So nobody can give you a rock-hard estimate on most materials as to what the final costs are going to be. And the other piece of it that's going to, especially when Lynn talks a little bit, permits the use of the data for reach purposes in most instances and reach purposes only. So if you need it in Korea, you need it in China, you need it in the United States, you're going to buy the exact same data all over again from the folks that own the data. That's why I said earlier, if by any chance you know of or have a drawer full of data, that data is very, very valuable. Just go really quick here on registration fees. 31,000 euros for single registration. So even the registration fees are not to be sneezed at. Registration issues. The deadlines, of course, sameness. One of the ways that companies are using this to their competitive advantage is in the substance identity profile. If one of the major players has some particular area where they have a different process that has a different contaminant profile, they can use that to their advantage because they can set the substance identity profile to a level that nobody else can meet. And that's being done. So you've got to be real careful on sameness. You are going to release process details. You can try to do it in a way that does not release your intellectual property. And you're also going to have to be real careful what you do with end uses and things like that. Anybody marketing products in the United States that does not take advantage of reading a REACH dossier that's been filed is missing an opportunity, because there's a huge amount of information in those dossiers. They're public documents. You can go on the ECHO website, draw it down, and you can get a real understanding of what the various end uses are, at least within the European Union, for the product that you're trying to market here or in the United States. And every so often you can learn something. Don't forget to register additives. One of the most interesting conversations I've had about this over the last few years, I went to see a company in Sandersville, Georgia that makes kaolin. I don't know if anybody's been to Sandersville, but it's an interesting place. They scrape away about that much topsoil, and what's below is pure white. It's kaolin. And natural substances technically are exempt from REACH. And we're sitting in this conference room, and the individual that owned the place was a tall, white-haired Southern gentleman. I'm sure if you said to Webster's, go find the Southern gentleman, they'd say, go find this guy. And we were having a conversation with a whole bunch of his folks, and at one point he got very frustrated, and he pounded the table, and he said, why are we doing this? We dig it, we crush it, we sift it, we bag it, and we ship it. And his technical director looked out the window and said, see that factory? We also pull out metals, we do all sorts of stuff. So the stuff that was just dug, sifted, crushed, bagged, fine. The other thing they did, less than 1% non-hazardous is not listed on a US MSDS sheet. The secret in a kaolin business is the anti-dusting, the dedustants, the anti-caking agents. And if you ship stuff in shiploads, it's not hard to get to a ton, even at 0.5%. And so all of their anti-dusting, dedustants, anti-caking agents were all REACH events, and the materials that they were shipping to some of the higher end uses, where there was in fact some chemical processing, that was all REACH event. Antitrust, there's a whole bunch of areas of REACH where if you did it in the United States, you'd be in violation of antitrust. So you've got to be super careful that you don't get yourself in jail. Importers of record need to have easy access to the numbers. Customs authorities in Europe are holding shipments. At the same time REACH went into effect, the Classification, Packaging, and Labeling Directive went in, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but safety data sheets must be in compliance. It's a different format than the United States, and in large instances, a lot of products, it has raised the level of hazard, which has had an impact on transportation rates. All of a sudden, you have something that's totally non-hazardous for shipping purposes in the United States, and when it gets to go to Europe, it has to have a hazardous label on it. Extended safety data sheets that go with REACH, some of these are 200 pages long. You can imagine how many people are really reading all that stuff. It is now possible for the importer, for the OR or the importer of record to handle this. And again, one product, one label. Just as an idea, a quick glance at test costs. If you're less than 10 tons, you're probably talking somewhere around 30, 40 grand. If you're over 10, you got the ones above it, so you've got about 300,000 euros. It's about $450,000 at the outside edge. Over 100 tons, you can see these numbers, you're getting well over millions and millions of dollars in testing. And there are some products that can stand it, there are some products that can't. Total cost, worst case scenarios, about $5 million. If you've got something that aims positive, you can figure you're going to dig an interesting hole. Restrictions. This is the place that's really coming back to bite us now. First round of restrictions is a thing called the CORAP, C-O-R-A-P, the Community Rolling Action Plan. The first time they did that an acronym, they forgot to put the O in it. And so that caused some difficulty for those of us that speak English. The first list was published on February 29, 2012 with 90 entries. There have been all sorts of lists published since then, and the individual community member states are responsible for reviewing materials that are on the so-called CORAP list. They're still in process. They have not released the final details of the 2013, or rather 2012 that was supposed to come out in the first quarter of 2013. They're expected out, some more of them are expected out literally the end of the month. The thing that's really been fun with this is that unless you are a registrant, you are not allowed to participate in the process. So you can be the largest manufacturer of the world sitting here in the United States, have a pre-registration, and these folks are doing all sorts of things that have a huge impact on your product, and you've got no influence at all. The other piece of it is companies like Walmart that are trying to be very proactive to make sure materials that are potentially on somebody's list are not on their shelves, are using these lists as a way to bludgeon companies to get things out of their products. Once a product is on a CORAP list, there's no way to get it off. And again, evaluations are conducted by the individual member states. Just as an example, so that you can get a feeling for really, in some respects, how nuts this is. These are some of the products that are on the CORAP list. You'll notice methanol, I mean, that's pretty widely used stuff. Parahydroxybenzoic acid was probably in stuff we ate today. Titanium dioxide. The speculation is that TiO2 is on the list because the Europeans are also at war over nano. And there are a lot of nano uses of TiO2, so that's probably why it's on the list, though it hasn't been published. There are some things on there that are pretty toxic, but not a lot, or triclosan. So a lot of widely used materials are subject to CORAP. Authorization. Basically, in the case of authorization, if a material is listed for authorization, thou shalt not use it unless the European Commission agrees that you can use it for particular end use. This is the first 14 products that were listed for authorization. And the one that I'd like to draw your attention to is diacetyl phthalate. I'm pretty sure that's the one, or it's either that one or the one above it, the ethyl hexyl phthalate. Rolls-Royce jet engines went to ECHA and they said, we absolutely positively need an authorization for this stuff, or the turbine blades in our jet engines are liable to fall apart. We can't figure out a substitute. And you would think that when somebody as powerful as Rolls-Royce goes to ECHA and says, we really need this, and you fly a lot too, and we don't think it's a good idea for jet engines to fall apart in flight, that the agency would have said, fine, here's your authorization. Quite the contrary. They put them through the ringer. It looks very positive that they will get that authorization, but they sure didn't make it simple. If it's an intermediate strictly controlled, it's not it won't be on these lists. And there are currently 138 chemicals on the SVHC list, including these 14. So that if you're using something on here or involved with something on here, not an intermediate, it's going to be a problem. One of the next ones that come up for authorization is the lead yellow, lead sulfochromate yellow. And part of what they have to determine there is, are they better off? That's the yellow. One of the end users is the yellow in a traffic line. Somebody's going to have to calculate how many guys get run over striping their lines versus the potential risk from continuing to use that lead chromate. Epilogue. There are some companies that are likely profiting from this. Maybe some of the larger EU companies are seeing some less competition, and so they're doing okay. There are companies that had an awful lot of data. There are companies that are squeezing their competition with this, so there are some that are absolutely profiting from it. 2010 was difficult. 2013 was unbelievably difficult. 2018 is a train wreck waiting to happen. It's definitely driving consolidations in both companies and portfolios. Small volume products will disappear from the European market. I mean, they just can't stand the cost of doing the work. Only high margin specialties can survive, and more finished articles will be imported to Europe. If you ship this table to Europe, there is no reach impact. You try to make this table in Europe, and all of a sudden, you've got a problem, because everything that's in it that's a chemical, including the resins and the paints and the coatings, all has to be REACH compliant. It's something like an automobile. They're much better off shipping them in than they are building them there, as long as they don't put oil in the crankcase and in the transmission, and the windshield washer fluid is left out of it and added once it gets there, so that anything that can be considered a chemical is not in the vehicle when it's exported to the European Union. It's put in when it gets there. It will continue to impede new products, and part of the thing that's a little scary, we're talking a little bit about TSCA reform, is resetting the inventory. It will have this same impact in the United States, that REACH is also impeding new uses of existing substances, because if you put in a use profile and somebody says, I want to use it for something else, that has to be filed, and if it has an impact on the registration requirements, it can cost you money. And it's handcuffing EU purchasing professionals. So thank you very much. Look forward to discussion when Lynn has completed her presentation, or if there's any specific questions, I'll be glad to entertain now. Unless you're a registrant, it's probably not available, because that is a discussion between the agency and the registrant. So they're not publishing well, there is when they take action against the dossier, that is published. But when they just, if you're a registrant and they just say to you, your dossier's got problems, that's a private conversation between you and the agency. Absolutely. The registrant is going to be in a discussion with the agency about fixing the dossier.
Right, but outside of that, prospectively, there's nothing available that would serve as guidance, things to avoid or things to make sure you're providing?
There are guidance documents from the agency on all of these topics, but sometimes the guidance is a little bit confusing, and there was an appeal decision published yesterday on a tiny little company called Infinium, where there was an argument about whether the substance identity profile was adequate or not. And there are other appeals that have been published, so you can, if you really got something that's technical, you can get in, you can see all those appeal documents, and you can see the way the agency has ruled on individual cases. But for the most part, unless they take a public action, the documents are not public.
70% deficiencies for something.
That came off of the ECHO website. They have published those numbers.
Okay, so the nature of those deficiencies is apparent?
Ill-defined at this point.
Ill-defined, okay.
Where are the Asian countries going? Are they mirroring REACH?
Lynn's going to talk about that.
Why don't we, let's move to Lynn, and then we'll do questions at the end for both speakers, and just in the interest of time. So thank you very much, Jim. We're going to switch gears now and talk about TSCA reform, which is front and center right now in Washington. We've got a bill in the Senate, and we've got a pending bill in the House, and the industry is supportive of both bills. They're very similar. So Lynn's going to talk about TSCA reform and specifically about some of the various provisions within those, within the one bill and the draft bill, if you will.
Do you have the remote clicker?
Who has the, do you have the remote?
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
This remote has been elusive today.
There you go.
All right. I'm going to do what Jim did. A very good friend of mine who's president of a nonprofit a number of years ago was at a formal affair and had a lovely black Prada gown on, very low cut, which I, of course, wouldn't go near. But this podium, it's not unlike the one that Margaret was before. And of course, all of the videos and snapshots of her looked like she was buck naked because the podium completely occluded her dress. So I avoid podiums because I am horizontally challenged. So on that happy note, number one, I'd like to thank the Dow Chemical Corporation for funding the Joseph Priestley Society and for being here today. It is my great pleasure, and I've enjoyed meeting and chatting with several of you. I want to briskly move forward. What have I done? Okay, I want to briskly move forward and talk about TSCA reform, a subject that sadly I've been talking about for at least half of my career. How many of you believe the Toxic Substances Control Act is flawed and needs to be amended? How many of you think that, you know what, EPA just did a lousy job of implementing some of it, and as prepared and as drafted, it's pretty damn good? Thank you, Craig. Anyway, we lawyers are of the view that although TSCA has a number of significant warts and significant implementation challenges, it is an elegant statute that, in my view, has withstood the test of time. It's been in play now for about 38 years. It's a very, very old but elegant statute. But because of the press of other chemical regulatory frameworks throughout the world, you just heard Jim give a masterful job of REACH. K-REACH, the Korean REACH program, kicks into gear January 1, 2015. Turkey implemented its own program a number of years ago. I was in Istanbul last week, and the folks there think TSCA is just an antiquated artifact that needs to be eliminated. You have chemical regulatory programs all over the world that probably do exceed the level of regulatory review than what we have here in the United States. In addition, you have a whole host of state initiatives that are far more progressive in addressing some of the more toxic chemicals of which we are aware. California implemented last October the Safer Consumer Products Regulation. And for those of you who are aware of what's going on in the state of California, and I'd love to talk about this more, especially with Larry and Jim and you folks, I think the California program is going to be the new standard for chemical regulation in the United States. And if we don't do something at the federal level, we are going to see many, many more separate, isolated, state-specific, patchwork regulatory programs that we're going to make it very difficult for business people in the United States to anticipate and plan for and manage their chemical programs efficiently. So for all of these reasons, TSCA reform has been a work in progress for at least 10 years. It's really picked up steam since last May. The Safer Chemicals Act of 2013, Mr. Lautenberg introduced in April. Very similar to what he had introduced years before that. It was kind of ho-hum boring. But then in May, the first bipartisan Senate bill came out. The Chemical Safety Improvement Act. Mr. Lautenberg partnered with his good friend David Vitter from the great state of Louisiana. And, you know, you could have blown me over with a feather, Larry. I did not see this coming. I did not see a bipartisan Senate measure to amend substantively in great detail TSCA. That was all well and good. There were lots of commitments to support it from both sides of the aisle and from the chemical community. And interestingly, Dr. Richard Dennison, my good friend from Environmental Defense Fund, supported it. So there was a hope that TSCA reform was going to happen before I die. Not a lot happened in 2013. There were commitments among members of the chemical community to work with it, but truth be told, it really didn't go that far. More recently, just this past February, as Larry indicated, we now have a House discussion draft called the Chemicals and Commerce Act, which in many respects, in my view, and I know this is heretical given this audience, but in my view, does not address the issues that are driving TSCA reform. And very simply, what are those issues? You know, there are a core number of issues that make TSCA the laughingstock of the global chemical community. Number one, the historic difference between new and existing chemicals. Existing chemicals largely have not been the subject of any type of regulatory review. New chemicals subject to review under TSCA Section 5. So that's a big distinction that REACH is eliminated, K-REACH is eliminated, Turkey REACH is eliminated, and that distinction remains in play under TSCA, but would be largely eliminated by the two new bills. In addition, there are significant concerns with confidential business information. The fact that under current law, the federal government cannot share with states or municipalities information pertinent to chemical toxicity. There is significant concern with EPA's inability to compel the production of testing with respect to existing substance under TSCA Section 4. And finally, there is significant concern under TSCA Section 6 with respect to limitations on EPA's ability to impose management restrictions on chemicals that are believed to pose risk. And because the standard under Section 6 is, as we all know, under the corrosion-proof fittings, EPA must demonstrate that it is using and availing itself of the least burdensome alternative, which is a very difficult standard as far as EPA is concerned to implement. How do you demonstrate something is the least burdensome standard against which you can abate a risk? So for those reasons, TSCA reform has been percolating for a number of years, but nothing much has happened until now. I just want to go through some really big picture topics so we can get to a panel discussion. I'm going to talk about some definitions, existing chemicals and new chemicals, and then step down and try not to go into the granularity that my slides might otherwise suggest. The CIC, the Chemicals and Commerce Act, largely retains the definitions set out in TSCA. There is this new intended conditions of use language, which drops a reference to disposal, which some of us in the legal community are a little bit concerned about what that might mean with respect to the end-of-life disposition of chemicals. So that's one of the uncertainties that's driving concern certainly in the environmental activist community about whether the House discussion draft really has traction and is going to go anywhere. On testing, this is TSCA Section 4, and again, one of the big drivers is, does EPA have sufficient authority to compel testing of chemicals on which it has little toxicity data? And again, remember, most chemicals, because of the way new and existing chemicals are defined under TSCA, most existing chemicals lack a sufficient body of toxicological and environmental fate information because they were grandfathered in and testing requirements were largely waived, unlike the new chemicals program where EPA does often request information. You're not compelled to do it, but you won't get your ticket punched under the PMN program if you don't provide information or a structural activity relationship or some sort of analog read-across data. So CIC revises the TSCA Section 4 in several important ways. Number one, it gives EPA consent agreement, order authority to require testing, which is now lacking. And it interestingly deletes the Interagency Test Committee altogether. Dr. John Walker, who has led that program for many years and retired a few months back, is not happy about that. But that is the agency that has identified chemicals that need testing. And as you know, one of the big problems under TSCA is that prioritization of chemical testing has not worked well. So this House draft would simply eliminate the Interagency Testing Committee altogether. The House draft differs from the Senate version, CSIA, by not including a very detailed overview of how chemical prioritization should happen, which I think is a good thing. If you read CSIA, it is very long and dense, complicated, I think bloated with discussion about chemical testing frameworks. So the House discussion draft is much more elegant in identifying a testing strategy that will prioritize chemicals and allow EPA to make a safety determination with respect to them. Under the House version, EPA would have authority to require testing of chemicals, existing chemicals now, to perform a determination about safety, to ensure compliance with restrictions on new or existing chemicals or significant new uses, to review chemicals intended only for export, which, as you know now, if you are manufacturing a chemical purely for export, you don't have to notify it to EPA under the TSCA program, and you can just kick it out, generate it, and export it. Under the House version, this would change, which is not making some folks happy. To help another federal agency implementing its own statute if the testing is needed to meet another statute's regulatory standard, which is an interesting extension of TSCA Section 9. I'm going to skip that one. New chemicals and significant new uses. Both the House and the Senate take a generally similar approach with respect to new chemicals and significant new use rules under TSCA. As under CSIA, the Senate version, EPA is required under TSCA Section 5 notice and make a determination, although the nature of the determination per se has changed a little bit. In the Senate version, it relates to whether or not the chemical is not likely to meet the safety standard, whereas in the House version, the standard is EPA action is dependent upon a determination as to whether the chemical is likely to result in an unreasonable risk of harm to human health or the environment. The House version also gives EPA authority to use those in CSIA to regulate new chemicals and significant new uses of chemicals, and it must implement any testing requirements subject to TSCA Section 4. The House version would clarify EPA's significant new use authority as it relates to articles. Now, as you know, the article debate has been a very significant one over the past several years because EPA at the administrative level has really extended its interpretation of significant new use rules and its authority over articles and the presence of chemicals in articles as they are mostly imported into the United States. So under the House version, EPA would be required to identify specific types of articles, and in taking any action, EPA would be required to determine that an unreasonable risk may result from an exposure to a chemical substance embedded in that article, which is now a finding that is not required under EPA's administrative interpretations of its authority under TSCA, and that such risk cannot be addressed adequately through existing requirements placed on a chemical substance. So it's a much higher burden to regulate articles because both of these findings would need to be made. So it's a real lock on EPA's authority, and in my view, and Larry, you can help disabuse me, it's a specific response to EPA given its growing authority to regulate chemicals in articles without having to make any type of specific correlation between the inclusion of that chemical in an article. The House version is also similar to the Senate version in that it retains the TSCA Section 5H exemptions for chemicals made in small quantities for experimentation and research analysis or test marketing if there's no significant human health or environmental exposure. So many of the exemptions are retained, which is a very good thing. Under the House discussion draft, EPA may request and by rule or order may exempt from notification, TSCA Section 5 chemical notification, new chemicals if they are under prescribed conditions and determine that the chemical is not likely to result in an unreasonable risk. I think that's a good add. It gives EPA authority to make certain presumptive exemptions from the TSCA Section 5 notification. So I know there's a lot of support for that. The corresponding section in TSCA was limited to a rulemaking opportunity, and notice and comment rulemaking today at EPA can take anywhere from 3 to 5 years. So if you need a chemical, a rulemaking and meeting that will not present an unreasonable risk safety standard is one tough nut. So this gives EPA the authority, in my view, that it needs to make those determinations upon a finding that it will not result in a reasonable risk. The House version includes a new exemption provision under Section 5 that does not have a counterpart in TSCA or the Senate version, and this concerns a provision for new chemical obligations for byproduct chemical substances. We're very close to this because this is our provision. It's intended largely to accommodate the reclamation and recovery of metals. Right now, there are a lot of metal extraction and reclamation operations that require a chemical process of some sort. And right now, the resulting chemicals from that chemical extraction process are required themselves to be notified because they're not subject to an existing exemption under the byproduct exemption. So this pushes that exemption out to include extracting component chemical substances language with, when you are using a chemical substance or other chemical reactive process. So it's a good add, and so far we're getting good support from supporting chemical societies to support that extension of the exemption. With respect to existing chemicals, the House version would require EPA to establish a system of designating all chemicals as either high priority or low priority, and list all active chemicals as high or low. Consistent with the Senate version, the House version does not impose a deadline for this prioritization process. So neither the House discussion draft nor the Senate contains any meaningful deadline for the prioritization of chemicals at all, which I think is a big deficit. And I think this, if anything else, is going to be the death knell of the legislative initiatives right now, getting huge pushback from the environmental activist community and many members of the chemical community, including myself, because we all know if there are not deadlines under federal law, nothing's going to happen. I'm trying to be controversial, because you guys might say, what the hell, if you put a deadline, EPA is going to miss it anyway. But I've got a problem with that. There are no deadlines embedded in either legislative vehicles. Unlike the Senate version, the House version does not include an element allowing for so-called inactive chemicals to receive a high priority designation. And concerning the factors to be considered as to what is high or low in assigning priorities, the House version does not include the Senate factor concerning state government recommendations. In other words, there's a very big debate going on right now in the context of the preemption debate as to how to involve state and local municipalities that have a very significant role and contribution, in my view, to play in identifying chemical priorities. So I think this is another important consideration that the House version is omitting that element and contribution from state and local municipalities, which organizations like ECOS and a number of state groups are pushing back on. Otherwise, the approach is pretty similar, but there are some important distinctions to determining priorities. Chemicals with the potential for high hazard, and this is now in the House version, for high hazard and high exposure are presumptively high priority chemicals, while those with high hazard or high exposure may be high priority. And I know this is an issue that many environmental groups have pushed back on, meaning that if you lack information on the chemical toxicity, the hazard portion of a chemical, and you may have information with respect to exposure, but you don't have both, there's a potential, many would argue, that under the House version, many more chemicals are going to be presumptively determined to be low priority. That is considered under the House version to be final agency action and subject to notice and comment, or subject to judicial review. The flip side of that, though, is because it's final agency action under the House version, states are preempted from imposing restrictions on those chemicals. So the big hole in the House version, according to many of our friends in the environmental activist community, is it maintains largely the status quo because there are a lot of chemicals on which neither hazard nor exposure information is had. Those will be deemed presumptively low priority as a final agency action, and states would be preempted from regulating them. So some believe that That looks a whole lot like the statute that we're trying to eliminate, and so why is this here? EPA, of course, may revise the priorities under the House version based on new information, but like anything else, getting new information before EPA in an administrative context takes time and money. So once those priority statuses are made under the House version, they're going to be there for a while. And priority designations are subject to notice and comment, as I said. As I mentioned this already, it's a very key change from the Senate version. The House version would make low priority designations subject to judicial review, which at first blush sounds great. But when you think about the preemptive effect, it's not so great. And that's why a lot of environmental folks are pushing back. EPA would also have the authority to acquire the development of information on hazards and exposures by using both a rule or order authority or entering into a consent agreement. And in both the House and Senate versions, EPA's expanded use of rule, order, or consent agreement is, I think, a welcome change under both versions. An important aspect of the legislation in both chambers is also what type of information must EPA rely upon. Lots of debate about quality of data and best available science. So under the House version, EPA would be required, and this is under the Senate version too, best available science and analyze the types of exposures, including for subpopulations, and incorporate reference parameters and consider threshold doses. So these are, I think, important adds that are in both versions and are being recognized as important additions to the law. If EPA determines that a chemical poses an unreasonable risk of harm to health of the environment, under its intended conditions of use, EPA would be required to issue a rule on that chemical substance with respect to risk abatement provisions. Now, the regulation may apply to mixtures or articles. EPA would be required to identify the specific type of article. EPA would be required to show that adequate mitigation measures obtained through restrictions on the chemical or mixture, and EPA shall exempt previously manufactured replacement parts. Again, that's, I think, the response of many back to EPA's increasing regulation of both mixtures and articles in ways that make the nexus between the chemical at issue and the article in which, or the mixture in which it's embedded, more attenuated than it should be. Restrictions that EPA is required and authorized to apply include the usual suspects: warning labels, use, exposure monitoring, restrictions, phase-outs, or volume limitations. These are many of the same restrictions the EPA has authority to implement now, but under the existing authority in Section 6, it has been very unable to apply effectively. With respect to the House version, Section 6 states that restrictions must be proportional to the risk avoided. It must result in net benefits. The restriction must be cost-effective. It must be imposed only when technically and economically feasible alternatives that materially reduce risk to health or the environment are unavailable. And it must be provided for over a reasonable implementation period. Now let's look at those 5 conditions. How many of you think it's going to be easy to meet that standard in imposing a risk mitigation measure that has been identified by EPA for a high priority chemical? Better than the existing standard under TSCA Section 6, which requires, again, a demonstration along the corrosion-proof fittings determination that the least burdensome alternative has been identified. I think this is infinitely tougher than least burdensome. And yet this is the House version for imposing a restriction on a high priority chemical only if you meet these criteria. Honest to God, I have no idea who came up with this. I have a feeling of who came up with it, but I don't agree with it. I think it's infinitely more difficult than what we have now, and for that reason, the House discussion draft was pretty much dead on arrival in this respect the minute it saw the light of day. And I'd like your thoughts in talking about this when we go to the panel discussion, because I think this is a step backward, not a step forward. Larry's clearing his throat because he's clearly uncomfortable. Anyway, a couple of other provisions I just wanted to bring to your attention. See, the House version has dropped the Senate provision at 6C10 concerning exemptions from regulation. There's a provision that allows, under the Senate version, for EPA to propose certain exemptions, and this would drop that, although there are other options available under another provision, 6F. An EPA determination that a chemical does not present an unreasonable risk in a final agency action subject to judicial review, and a decision that a chemical does not present an unreasonable risk is subject to judicial review as final agency action when the control rule is promulgated, which means you can't assert a judicial action as final agency action unless and until EPA has issued a final rule that would mitigate the risk. So a determination that something is poses an unreasonable risk as a high priority chemical is not subject to review until the final rule imposing the risk mitigation measure has been promulgated. Couple of thoughts with regard to where we are at right now. There hasn't been, in my view, and Larry, you may know more, a lot going on the Hill since the House discussion draft was issued. There have been a couple of hearings, and there's likely to be another one after in late April or early May. Mr. Shimkus has indicated there should be another House hearing. But with regard to the remaining days in Congress before the midterm election, I am not optimistic that the very significant differences between CSIA, Senate 1009, and the House discussion draft can be harmonized, which means we have a lot of momentum coming into 2014, but it's unlikely that that momentum is going to materialize in a bill that both chambers in this highly polarized Congress can support. You've got significant pushback from some very significant detractors of TSCA reform as embedded in these provisions, particularly the provision with respect to the legal gauntlet EPA must clear in imposing risk mitigation measures on high priority chemicals under the House discussion draft. So you've got a finite number of days, you've got the midterm elections coming up, and you've got a very high probability that next year the new Congress is going to be different, and perhaps significantly so, than what it is this year. So I question whether we are going to see TSCA reform ever. I really have doubts about that.
Bold statement.
I just gave this talk, I think, 8 years ago, and we're talking about it now. I gave it when my daughter was entering grade school, and she graduates from college next month. So, and here is what I want to offer as an alternative. Instead of TSCA reform, why don't we recognize that TSCA as it exists is not that bad, that the mistakes that were made under corrosion-proof fittings with respect to trying to regulate asbestos are not because of statutory defects, it was because of a failure of advocacy on EPA's part. And had it been done right, we wouldn't be having this discussion. And that EPA should be doubling down on improving its existing administrative infrastructure. EPA needs additional funding resources to get the job done, and forget about TSCA reform. Just work with what we have, do it better, do it smarter, and quit trying to amend a statute that for the last 10 years we have failed to do, and it's not looking good this year. But I really want to leave you with that thought, because I really want your thoughts on whether that is a viable alternative to what we have now, which is a whole lot of talk and no action. And all the while, all of the other chemical regulatory frameworks and initiatives around the world are causing us to embrace standards that are not of our own making. They are being driven by safer consumer regulations in California, by European REACH measures, by Asian REACH measures that in many respects, K-REACH goes beyond REACH because of the downstream notification and communication requirements. So wanted to posit that as a thought, get your thoughts, and look forward to our panel discussion. Thank you very much.
So Lynn is certainly not one to withhold her opinion. Just a couple caveats on the bills that are in Congress. The Senate bill, which has been around now for a little more than a year, strange bedfellows with Lautenberg, who soon passed away just weeks after the bill was announced, with Senator Vitter. That one has bipartisan support, so there's Republican and Democratic support for S1009. The House bill has not dropped yet, so it's just, as Lynn said, it's a discussion draft. We don't know exactly when that bill is going to drop. SACHA is having a fly-in where we bring our members to Washington at the end of this month, and we'll be discussing TSCA reform, among other things. We're a little more optimistic that something's going to happen this year, although with the time frame that you outline, I'm not a betting man, so I'm certainly not going to put any money behind my feelings here. So there were some questions in the audience after Jim finished, and I think we can open it up now for questions of either panelist. We have a roving mic front here.
Does this work?
Yeah,
Mr. Richmond.
For Lynn, first of all, was your advocacy for TSCA reform fees sufficient to cover college tuition?
I don't think any amount of advocacy is sufficient. I have 2 college tuitions I'm supporting right now.
Maybe there's another 8 years before. I'm just wondering, TSCA, EPA, and FDA, and USDA have, are competing regulatory agencies, and the overlap or the boundaries. So is TSCA, are pharmaceutical manufacturing operations exempt from TSCA? Where are the lines? Because many of us service multiple industries, and it gets very confusing as to which regulations apply.
Ed, you're exactly right. There are very significant jurisdictional issues that chemical manufacturers, depending upon the ultimate application of their innovation, are directed. A chemical that is being prepared and ultimately to be included into a pharmaceutical application is subject to TSCA at the beginning. Once it becomes part of a pharmaceutical process, that's when the FDA jurisdiction takes over and EPA jurisdiction ceases. Similarly, for a pesticide active ingredient, pesticides and industrial chemicals can often, be the same. It depends upon the use. If you intend a chemical to be used in a pesticidal application, it's subject to FIFRA. If you intend it to be in an industrial application for industrial applications, it's subject to TSCA. I don't think TSCA reform does anything to sort out the jurisdictional roulette that is out there. You need to be very careful in manufacturing chemical substances and be mindful of the use to which it is being put and where it stands in the continuum of its ultimate disposition, whether it's in a pharmaceutical active ingredient, an active ingredient in a pesticide product, or an industrial chemical that is simply being used for industrial applications only. And that status can change and evolve depending upon the use to which that chemical is going to be put. TSCA reform doesn't really amend that at all. It continues to be a very dicey field and the subject of continuing questions from clients all the time. When does FDA begin? When does EPA cease? But TSCA reform does not amend that at all.
But Lynn, correct me if I'm wrong, if you have an API, the API is strictly for a drug, isn't FDA going to govern that process from start to finish, that it's not going to be anything with TSCA? I thought with APIs as an example, or any intermediate or additive that just is going into a drug, TSCA has nothing to do with that.
I think once it goes, it has to be put on the inventory before it is amenable for inclusion in a FDA process.
Okay. Does that help?
So, well, yeah. So if a pharmaceutical company wants to buy a new substance from you, and it's in the early synthesis ladder for an API, do you
Intended
or
only
they
for
have
API?
to do a PMN?
No, No, and if it's intended purely for pharmaceutical
That's what I'm saying, if
applications.
it's purely
no.
pharmaceutical.
You know, from start to finish, that's where it's going, no.
Right.
Because traditionally, a lot of us suppliers to multiple customers, we may list something in our product base.
Right,
And then you have to be very careful if a non-pharma company wants to buy it.
Yes.
right.
It it
Yes.
has to be tagged, so.
Well, how do you do that? I mean, do you say for R&D purposes only until you know what the ultimate use is going to be? If it's in a pharmaceutical application, you're out from TSCA Section 5. If you don't know that yet, how do you promote the chemical for purposes of marketing it?
Well, very carefully. No, we have to, you have to tag it internally
Right,
so that to prevent it from just a casual sale to somebody else.
Right.
And then EPA finds out about it.
Right.
And then they go back in time and, the penalties are just gigantic compared to. And that's where a lot of people get tripped up because
Yeah.
it may be a product for many years. Maybe they've stopped supplying the pharmaceutical company. They just have it sitting around and they find another application and nobody remembers
if it's on or
that
not,
it
right.
wasn't because maybe they produced a few tons. So nobody's thinking PMN, TSCA.
Right.
No, you're exactly right, Ed. And I know when you are offering a chemical for sale, a lot of the offerings simply say TSCA compliant because it might fall under an R&D exemption or it might fall under an export-only exemption. But it does get very tricky, and you need to be mindful of how it's characterized for purposes of the existing TSCA program, for sure. Jim, did you have any thoughts on that?
Thank you, covered it. Just one comment on TSCA reform in itself, though. I was at SACHA's fly-in last year. If you're a member of the organization, definitely come where it's in a couple of weeks. And Senator Inhofe came in the room when we were sitting there, and one of the things we were talking about TSCA reform, and he said, please don't fix it. If you do, I can't kill it. So there is a significant constituency in Congress that just wants to see TSCA reform go away.
Yeah. Got a question in the front here?
Under both REACH and TSCA reform, if there is a reset of the inventory and someone wants to maybe revive a chemical that's been taken out of commerce at some point, are they going to have to treat that as an entirely new chemical and start from scratch as far as registration or PMN submission?
Well, under REACH, there is no grandfathering, so, but the only extent of grandfathering is if it's got an existing INEX number and it's less than 100 tons at this point and it's not a CMR, you can do it till 2018. But if we're sitting here in 2019, the INEX lists are gone, so there is no grandfathering. Under TSCA reform, I would assume that if the inventory gets reset, then it would be considered a new chemical if it's not on the inventory.
Well, if a chemical is not now on the TSCA inventory, and it's, if the inventory is reset, that's a null set, because if it's not on the inventory now, it's not going to be on any new inventory. If it's on the inventory now and it's not currently being marketed under the administrative reset that EPA proposed a number of years ago,
Right.
manufacturers and others would have an opportunity to elect it to get on the reset inventory, so you wouldn't have to go through the PMN process again. Remember that the reset is intended to do what Larry indicated needs to be done. There's a misperception that there are some 87,000 chemicals in commerce, which of course is entirely unfair. There are probably fewer than half of that.
We
based
think
on
there's
our-
25 to 30,000.
Right.
But the environmentalists will tout the 80,000 number and say, oh, but there's only 200 that have been reviewed out of the 80,000, making it sound like a much smaller sample size.
Right, which is entirely misrepresentative.
Totally
of-
misrepresented, but
which-
the 80,000 number is everywhere.
It's everywhere.
It's
and
tattooed on everybody's
wrong.
foreheads.
We have clients that put chemicals on the inventory all the time and never commercialize it, except for
Yeah.
the initial notice of commencement, and then get out of the market. So, but under the reset that is anticipated under the law and under the administrative reset, you would have an opportunity to elect to get a chemical in commerce on the new reset inventory. And if entities neglect to do that within the prescribed period of time, it would turn into a new chemical for which a notification or an LVE or other exemption would be submitted. And it would have the value of having a real reflection of currently, in commerce substances. And so EPA, as you know, is considering a FACA-like Federal Advisory Committee Act discussion group to get people together to talk about things like inventory reset and how can we address some of the peculiarities right now with the TSCA PMN process and other administrative issues. But that's not TSCA reform, that's just empowering EPA to fix some of the problems with TSCA as it exists now administratively, which I think is a good idea.
Right. And another issue that has been come up is this whole CBI declassification. So the industry was conferred, I guess the EPA went out to the industry back in 2011
Right.
and asked for companies to review all of their CBI disclosures and identify those that they were willing to lift or basically declassify. And we have taken quite some time, our membership and those of others, to do that, to go through the declassification process. And I think thousands of CBI claims have been basically lifted. So the system is working. It's a voluntary system and it's working quite well.
Yeah, I know Jim Jones has expressed a lot of
Yeah.
support for trade associations like SACHA and
Yeah.
ACC because of its, I think, very receptive response to
Mm-hmm.
declassifying a lot of information that probably didn't need to be asserted
Correct.
as CBI.
That's right. I think we had a question, were we in the middle there? Yep.
The EPA administrator and also EPA policy entrepreneurs play an important role in this debate. And so I'm curious as to what the EPA, in your discussions with EPA individuals, what their thinking is on, or their stance on both of the bills that are currently in play.
Well, I'll tell you that we don't really know. The EPA has not been very communicative in terms of what their position is on either bill. And we have gone to the regulators, we've gone to the folks that are focusing on TSCA reform, Jim Jones, who we just mentioned, and he has been less than forthcoming, quite frankly, thus far on either of the bills. Now, again, the Senate bill's been out for over a year, and you would have thought that they've already taken a look at it, kicked the tires, so to speak, but publicly they're not telling us what they think about it. The House bill is not a bill yet. Gina McCarthy, the new head of the EPA, who we know very well, has said that they're taking a very close look at it. But that's a really good question. We just don't know what the EPA thinks about either of the two bills. You may have some different intelligence, but
No, I
it's
think
been quiet.
Larry is exactly right. I think EPA's official position is the administration takes no, the EPA administration takes no position on TSCA reform. I think EPA has been very outspoken, and Jim Jones, the Assistant Administrator of the Toxics Office, has been very clear about where he wants to place his priorities. He's putting his priorities in the Work Plan Chemicals Program. He's putting his priorities in the CBI recertification program. He's putting his priorities in programs that are specifically within his wheelhouse. And he's saying basically, look at whatever they do on Capitol Hill, I'm a foot soldier for the administration and I'll adhere to it. But the government, the EPA is taking no position on TSCA reform. As much as I think behind the scenes they would like to see it, Administrator Jackson, the administrator that Mr. Obama selected in 2009, came up with her principles of TSCA reform and has been an outspoken advocate, as her successor, Gina McCarthy, in supporting the principles of TSCA reform. But neither administrator has supported TSCA reform measures introduced by any House or Senate or House chamber.
Former Administrator Jackson's concept of TSCA reform is reach,
It's true.
sadly.
It's true.
Back there?
I'd like to go back to a concept that Lynn talked about in best available science. This is one that I've had a lot of experience with. There are a couple of instances that I just want to bring to light. One is a bias. I've worked with the EPA a lot on risk assessments. I'm a toxicologist by training. So when you look at all those data and the bias, sometimes against industry data, to the point where they say we'd rather see sometimes academic or other government type of data. Well, the industry does all their testing under good laboratory practices. The EPA does not use good laboratory practices in their labs, and most academic labs do not use it. When I asked the EPA head of NHERL, which is the National Health Environment Effects Laboratory, why they didn't use GLP, he told me it's too expensive. So that's That's the government side of it. And then the other part of best science is when you do a risk assessment, you might have 4 or 5 studies around the same endpoint. They tend to pick the one that fits their model the best and ignore the other 4 or 5 studies when, if you look at the totality of it, it's not so clear. So I think that concept is very important, and I think it's intuitive to us as scientists, but it's not intuitive to me how they apply it. So I'd like to get your comments on that, Lynn.
Go ahead.
Well, no, I'm happy to comment. I think the provisions with respect to best available science and weight of the evidence are important contributions to TSCA reform. There is a significant amount of noise out there as to what is best available, how to weight, what is weight of the evidence. I know the Society of Toxicology just 2 weeks ago submitted a letter to both the House and the Senate, I think, on trying to define better from a scientific perspective how should weight of the evidence and best available science be defined from a scientific perspective, because there is a lack of clarity out there. So in my view, both the House and the Senate versions go a long way in defining more precisely what best available science should be. But at the end of the day, as you know well, Craig, reasonable people can disagree as to what is best, what is available, and what is scientifically defensible. And that debate is probably not amenable to clear resolution in the House or the Senate. It's fundamentally a scientific debate, and one where EPA will be given a lot of latitude and discretion at the end of the day, as it has for so many years. So a legislative fix is a tall order, particularly on concepts that are largely scientific. And as you know too, and as Jim indicated, mutual acceptance of data, are data that are generated and accepted for REACH purposes going to be equally useful and efficacious for registration purposes under TSCA, under K-REACH in Korea? I mean, these are global issues that the OECD, the World Health Organization, and other organizations, I think, are grappling with. But in my view, they are not amenable easily to a legislative fix because they are, at their heart, scientific issues.
Well, one of the other things that complicates it, the so-called robust studies are public documents under REACH. For whatever set of reasons, the EPA has decided that they don't want robust studies, they want complete studies. And so there is all sorts of legal tussles because even if a United States company is a member of a consortium that develops information in Europe, the U.S. company does not own that data. It's owned by the consortium, and there have been some lawsuits and some issues about trying to force U.S. companies to disclose information that, frankly, they don't have legal title to, whereas in order for a study to be acceptable to REACH, the Klimisch numbers are included. 1 and 2 is used without issue, 3, okay for some purposes, 4, forget. And so the EPA, if they could revise their provisions and accept the robust studies for Klimisch 1 or 2 rated studies, it could probably solve some of these issues. But so far there's no indication they're prepared to do that.
Jim raises a good point, because EPA announced maybe a month or so ago its consideration of using its TSCA 11C subpoena authority to compel the production of data, that are submitted under the European program for REACH registration purposes. And as Jim correctly indicates, if they're consortia owned, you need the consensus of all of the owners before releasing those data, even if you have an undivided interest in the entirety of that study.
That's right.
So EPA said, fine, we'll subpoena the data. That means you will have an order by a government agency that compels the production of those data. Would that help? You know, the ask pretty much was, will that help get over this hurdle?
No, but it's not hard to argue that the EPA, much like ECHA, does not have the ability to sue a non-U.S. person, and that data is held by an EU person, so I don't see how the EPA can subpoena the data.
Well, if it's BASF core, that might be, you know, I think it gets the ownership issue, the jurisdictional reach issues, the long arm of the law issues get complicated.
If I was involved with a company, I would suggest you give the EPA the data, but you know, it's not my decision.
Exactly.
So if it was me, I wouldn't want to spend money to put Lynn's grandkids through college but others have made alternate choices.
Jim,
But it's a legal morass.
It is a legal morass.
Jim, have you heard anything, so again, right now, the consortia data cannot be obtained by the EPA. Have you heard anything with respect to the K-REACH and ECHA? Would there be some proposed transfer or sharing of data between those two regions? Have you heard anything to that effect?
I haven't heard anything yet, well, because K-REACH really hasn't come into effect yet, so you
Right.
won't really hear that for another 6 or 8 months. But,
any rumblings
on
about
the
that?
surface, if somebody wants to buy data from a consortium in Europe to use for K-REACH, they're going to have to buy the data.
To buy the data.
And clearly, most of the consortium agreements I've seen, and certainly the ones I'm involved with, are very specific that data is for use for REACH purposes only. So that the consortium is going to have to agree.
Just one comment on that. I think it's very ironic that the EPA takes this position because way before REACH, we did the high production volume program. We worked very hard with the EPA to design how the robust summaries would be written, and the whole concept was you write a robust summary so any questions that a competent toxicologist would have be answered. And now they're saying they don't have enough information to do that assessment. I think that's pretty ironic when you look at that full circle.
We agree.
Yeah. Middle?
Isn't the primary reason why we need to have all these regulations is a concern for our public health?
No doubt, and the industry of 50, 60, 70 years ago deserved it, absolutely deserved it. But one of the things, frankly, that really bugged me, when the 2010 deadlines and the statistics were released, the EU was very proud of the fact that less than 50% of the so-called CMRs that were expected to be registered were registered. And they thought this was a great sign that REACH was working, that things were being substituted. And maybe it was, but more likely, unless those CMRs that were not registered in Europe, the end products from those materials, if they're still being used in Europe, all you've done is you've transferred the use of the CMR to a place where it was not properly regulated. I was involved with a company a few years ago that did a dumping case on a very innocuous final product, but one of the stages was very hazardous. And in this particular instance, the dumping case was against an Indian company, and there was a discussion about a very hazardous stage, and what the Indian company simply said was, we don't allow anybody in that part of our factory that's less than 60 years old. Those practices are still being done in some parts of the world, and I would submit that if you chase some of these materials that are for critical applications out of places where they're carefully controlled, like the European Union or the United States, and you push them, it may not be India anymore, but it's going to be Vietnam, and it's going to be someplace else where people are going to find a way to get it done cheap, and continue to supply so that John Consumer doesn't see any changes, that's a serious mistake.
I agree. The reason why we do these things is to protect this health, and so the point I wanted to make out of this, we've discussed here a very specific part of that. There are all kinds of risks, and here we're concerned about our health. What is the single most important risk to the health of our species is this, is it not? The failure of people like me, since I'm in my 8th decade now, to be able to convince people that you need to understand the relationship between the caloric density of foods and the regulations that this body has placed upon it. Notice, if I have to choose what the greatest health problem is in the world today, it's that we're fat. We don't eat this stuff. So here, so I agree with everything that's been said here today, but notice, compared to that, this lack of understanding between the caloric density of foods and how this magnificently chemically designed system operates, people like me have failed totally in understanding that When we get that, then we wouldn't even need to worry about these toxics. Now, just for full disclosure in this thing, I've been involved in all kinds of specific controls in this thing, beginning as a trainee with the Food and Drug Administration. And guess what one thing I did at that time? There was a debate, and a congressman from Wisconsin wanted us to check up restaurants to see whether they had margarine labeled as opposed to butter. Now, it might be nice to talk about how we're going to get the Food and Drug Administration and regulators to do this. Notice when you get down to the level of the guy who's the inspector who goes around and tries to carry out these weeds, there has been zero improvement from my point. So I agree this is not appropriate to the topic of this session, but then we need to put this into the larger picture of what the world's really about.
That's a very good point. We appreciate that.
Okay, all right. I think we got time for one more question. Right there? Yep.
I was just going to ask a question regarding CBI and REACH. And CBI was mentioned a number of times. I think it's a really important issue because, well, for one thing, you don't know where all that data is going. I mean, we have an idea, but once it gets there, who's it being shared with? What are the precautions? And so I just wonder if you could talk more about CBI.
Technically, the data that you file with the agency is unless you request confidentiality, it's public. But part of the place where CBI is being released is in end uses, because you may not want to really tell the world what the variety of end uses for your substance are. And, in some instances, you've got competitors where one is only supplying one end use and you're supplying 20. MSDS sheets have an enormous amount of information on them, some of which is considered proprietary. The methods of manufacture need to be briefly described in a dossier. Some of that information is public. So you need to be very careful that anything that's filed you understand is subject to release, and that you pay the fees for stuff that you want to be considered confidential and hope that they agree, because they may or may not agree that what you're asking to be confidential will be held in confidence. So there are all sorts of issues involved here on CBI that need to be carefully considered. And it may be, we just did some testimony as SACHA to the ITC, and one SACHA member company in particular simply said, I'm not selling my materials in Europe because I don't want to release the amount of information I have to release in order to get a REACH registration. I don't want the chance that my competitors will understand that. So they simply decided not to sell to Europe. And when you get down to the 2018, I believe more and more companies are just going to say, no, we're not going to spend the money, and we're not going to give you the information. And therefore, if you want the finished good that's made from my product, you'll buy the table made in the United States rather than build the table in Europe.
And to Jim's point, oftentimes the name of your chemical will tell somebody how it's manufactured. So you come up with a structurally generic name.
Yeah.
And ACC, I think, developed a task team a year or so ago working with Jim Jones and his people to come up with some sort of methodology so that CBI of somebody's product name will not give away the farm. And that's a big issue, obviously, for SACHA members, because innovation is key. Companies will spend years developing a new molecule, spend millions of dollars, and then based on the way it's named, if that information becomes released to the wrong party, i.e. folks overseas, they're going to reverse engineer that molecule, and then they're going to get right into business.
Just to add on to what Larry's saying, there's a whole bunch of materials out there that don't have CAS numbers. So what you actually, what you register is the reaction product of A, B, C, and D.
Right.
Is the way it's described in the registration dossier. And simply by saying that, in many instances, you've given away the CBI. But there is no other way to get a registration dossier done. So you have to be careful.
And one final point, I've said this many times, I think data, not just innovation, not just the IT of your pixie dust, but just the data supporting that innovation is really the new currency of the 21st century. And you need a very thoughtful plan of how you are managing and how you are capitalizing on that investment, because there are opportunities under existing TSCA legislation, as there are and have been for years under FIFRA, to offer those data for compensation, and managing them, keeping them out of the public domain, makes them available for compensation, data compensation. If you don't do that smartly and efficiently, as these other REACH-like programs propagate around the world, you are missing a bet. And it requires a lot of discipline, and I think Jim said it best, companies are not doing that well right now.
Well, but part of what happened, using the analogy of the sandbox, if you think of the Substance Information Exchange Forum, the Europeans, if you're going to be a supply material in Europe, you must join the CEF. The European Union assumed that the CEF would be a gigantic sandbox, that everybody that played in that product would get in the sandbox and they'd play nice, like little children. And if there's no money involved, that's what would happen. If it was only the toxicologist and the scientist, that's exactly what would happen. As soon as you put $1 on the table, there's a hard business guy that's saying to his toxicologist, no, you can't give that away. And yes, we know this, but you can't tell that to our competitors. And so the sandbox concept that the folks that designed the law expected to happen doesn't work because of the dollars and cents and the competitive aspects that are involved.
Okay, all right. I want to take this opportunity to thank all of you for your active participation this afternoon. A lot of great questions. Thank our panelists, Jim and Lynn. And thanks for the opportunity to moderate today's session, and I'll turn it over to Tom. Okay.